Hi, welcome everyone to this panel discussion and our esteemed panel. I will let them introduce themselves in a second. So, our task today is to talk about how the disinformation careers, openings, opportunities are shaping in the field and provide some insights into what this area of concentration looks like in politics. Whether you call it disinformation or information pollution or malign influence operations, so many different words, it essentially means the same thing, which is really ability to take propaganda to scale and using the tools of big tech to get there is what makes this so problematic for democracy at home and all around the world. What we really want to talk about is this journey. This is not a field that I intended in specializing, and in fact, don't view myself necessarily as a specialist, but we'll talk about that in a bit. What I want us to cover is that question of expertise, what the learning curve is in the way that we need to bring others into better understanding how disinformation affects their interests, where the gaps are in the field, how we connect it better to social justice movements, and bring forward our ability to fight and recognize the bias, gender and race, that is underneath a lot of the disinformation that we see, and then really share some advice for getting further engaged. So I will tell my own story in a bit, but I first want to start with Jacobo and Lori, and Vanessa Cardenas will join us hopefully shortly, to really just start from an introduction of who you are, how you got into fighting disinformation, and then we'll sort of jump further into the conversation. Jacobo, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Christina. So I'm Jacobo. I work with Ekis Labs. Ekis Labs is a research and experimentation hub trying to find, the best ways or new ways to engage the Latino community. And so Ekis Labs as an organization does a lot of polling and research and things like that. But I specifically focus on disinformation research. And so what I do is do a lot of monitoring of, key trends, narratives, things that we're seeing online, targeting the Latino community, but also targeting the community more broadly, and trying to identify some of these problematic narratives that we're seeing often, as Christina mentioned, disinformation, misinformation, or other terms that people use to kind of describe these harmful narratives that we're seeing online. I got into this by kind of after around the 2020 election, I guess. So I was working in political research, which there's kind of a tie to the disinformation research as well. But a lot of the research that I was doing over the last few years has been around political research for campaigns or committees, kind of focusing on the what people call opposition research, self-research, vetting, things like that. And there's a lot of kind of, while they're not the same as kind of the disinformation research I do now, there's a lot of kind of alignment on how maybe some of the tactics to do research, especially when it comes to monitoring pieces online, using social media to try to find key trends and narratives. So it kind of as after 2016, a lot of kind of the disinformation became more maybe public. A lot more people in the public kind of became more aware about it, and made more people in politics became more aware about it. I kind of got interested in this space and wanted to try to do my part to help kind of counter this disinformation, especially in the Latino community where it's become pretty problematic.
Absolutely. And I want to dig further into that in a moment too. Lori, how did you come to be on this panel and in this field?
Well, the panel was easy because that was an invite from the indefatigable Amy Pritchard, but I would call myself sort of an accidental disinfo campaigner. My background is really in both campaign politics and advocacy in the Democratic Party, and working with candidates and campaigns and ballot initiatives and advocacy groups. And a couple of years ago, I ended up with a client who, some people may have seen this recently, but it was the small civil rights group called Integrity First for America, who just sued the Nazis down in Charlottesville with ginormous judgments of millions of dollars against some neo-Nazis and all of the white supremacist groups. But at the core of that case was actually all of the disinformation and the planning that happened online, because the defendants in that case really used places like Telegraph and Gab and Discord to actually plan the rally and coordinate against to commit racially motivated violence. And so I spent a couple of years, working with them, and actually the last 3 years working with them. But that led me to sort of think about this issue more. And then literally it was a conversation that Christina and I had one day, where she sort of told me about this disinfo project that she was working on, and I sort of, in a, you can call it a stroke of brilliance, or something I'll live to regret for the rest of my life, basically thought, well, why isn't the Jewish community thinking more about Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism? And why are they not speaking up on this? And started working with this project to actually get the Jewish community to actually speak out more against the harms on the platform, specifically around Holocaust denial. And actually was sort of instrumental in getting Facebook in particular to back down on its Holocaust denial platform and policy. And since then, I've gone on to sort of work on what we largely call corporate accountability, but basically platform accountability for all of these bad actors in the space who, don't seem to change their policies in a way that, really tamps down on the disinformation and bad actors that are out there.
Getting 600 rabbis to sign on to an action against Facebook, I think, is a major claim to fame there. And I want to talk more about some of the related campaign efforts that are still needed. But let me go to Vanessa. Vanessa, thank you for joining. We are just telling our story of origin as it relates to how did you get involved in fighting this disinformation problem that is making our world much worse these days.
Yeah, no, thank you again for having me. And it's great to be in this panel with good friends and warriors in the cause. My name is Vanessa Cardenas, and let's see, my connection to this information actually was by chance. I've actually worked mainly on the policy/advocacy field, the bulk of my career. I worked on a variety of issues from immigration to climate change. I did a stint at Emily's List, doing work around electing more Democratic women to run for office. And last year, I connected with a big disinformation project that was very much focused on the 2020 election. And it was really fascinating. As someone who's, again, I also have a communications background, but it was super interesting because it's at the intersection of technology, democracy, civil rights, and just all the issues that we all care about. So it's been a really interesting sort of last 2 years in working in this space. And, like I said, most of my career I have spent it doing policy and advocacy. So, but also doing communications in those roles. So the disinformation space, of course, has so many connections to the communications work that we do day in and day out. And I think what the disinformation challenges does for us now is to really stretch ourselves as communicators, to really, one, understand just the threats on itself of disinformation and how it affects our communities, but also really, I think, brings to light just the massive infrastructure that the right has developed when it comes to pushing their own message. So that's one piece of this. And then how they have really maximized in using the social media platforms to activate their base. So I think, what is a challenge for us as progressives is, one, we're already behind when it comes to the communications infrastructure. So it's a really big obstacle when we are sort of facing what the right has already built for decades, right? Like we all know, like the fact that the right has Fox News and local radio, and they have also been investing in print media at the local level. But obviously what's different now is that with social media platforms, with Facebook groups, with WhatsApp groups, it's even harder to sort of break in those spaces to really communicate our messages and our voices. So that's one piece of it. Having said that, if there's one thing that I learned from sort of the work that we did last year, and we work closely with X and other groups, is we do have a compelling message when we coordinate with each other, when we communicate with each other, and when we amplify our messages. And even though the right might have such a big, broad infrastructure, what we have on our side is the fact that there are many of us. I like to think many more of us out there that really sort of support a progressive vision. And I also feel that our messaging, when delivered right, really it's a winning message when we again invest the time and resources and sort of and have the research to actually communicate to folks. So I would say that in terms of the disinfo work, in terms of the skills, one of the things that I keep on saying, it doesn't matter whether you're a policy person or a communicator. I think what's really important is to really have the pulse of the community, right? I think what people what you're looking for, whether it's a policy idea or a communications message, is people need to know that you care about them, that you care about the issues that they care about, that you're speaking to the concerns that they have. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have as progressives is that we're always talking about the policy, because we're such policy wonks, and we like to talk about the policy solutions and the bills that are in Congress right now going through the legislative process. But as good communicators would tell you, and one of the most important things that we can do is speak to the values and to really sort of the concerns that people have day in and day out. So that's one, I think, skill that's really important. Another lesson from last year when it comes to just the Latino space, it's just the lack of capacity that we have when it comes to researchers and investigators and people that really know how to monitor this information. It's not very difficult, but it's something that definitely can be learned. And I don't know if Jacobo has already spoken, but he can probably speak a little bit more to that. But we really also need to build a lot of capacity in the Latino community so we can have not just good communicators, but also really a lot of researchers and investigators who are going to help us make sense of everything that we're seeing, and also keep us on top of the key issues that disinformation is pushing around. So anyway, so those are some of the thoughts that I have. I don't know if that helps, but we can just start the conversation there.
So what you're addressing, Vanessa, and what Lori and Jacobo have also said, kind of we see sort of the menu of experience that has less to do with the technology. So far, we haven't talked much about the technology, and more about communications, opposition research, policy, organizing. To tell a little bit about my journey to this field, I am a democracy activist, is how I am most comfortable describing my work. And I had an opportunity to do a lot of that rooted in US politics and US organizing, where I first met Lori, actually, when she was with Fieldworks and teaching the tools of grassroots petitioning when I headed the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center. And, that was an incredible experience to really see the far right at work, with similar, like the hallmarks of disinformation actually expressed through their referenda policy, which was to lie and divert, attention to nonsense issues and to fake real people and engagement, and even getting measures on the ballot. So similar to what we see in the online disinformation. I had the opportunity and sort of luck to do this work abroad, and ran a very large program for the National Democratic Institute headed in Ukraine, leaving the U.S. after Obama got elected, which I don't think any Democrat did at the time. To me, it was clear we weren't really going to focus on states and grassroots organizing. And I wanted to see how these tools worked in different contexts. And so I thought I would be gone, a couple years seeing that work and then head back to the US and dig back in. And what I realized is that the ability to understand how to fight authoritarianism and how to use people and grassroots power to push back was just an incredible experience. And I kept going from country to country, and 27 countries later, there I was with this toolkit of really understanding the way that far right actors are undermining elections and democracy and manipulating communication as a key tenet of how they organize this work. But growing concerned, of course, in 2016, after Trump won, of what we would actually see in the next election. So I moved back to the US and really looked around to determine, well, what is the best thing that I can lean into related to the election and having a fair and free election, and one with integrity. And it was really disinformation that was the gap among US civil society groups, because most of the emphasis was really focused on think tank work. I learned a lot from people like Jory Craig, who had also really come to the US from a lot of international experience and trying to point us all in the right direction about how we should think about what skills are needed. And that really formulated into a process which many of us on this panel worked with to do whatever we could to bring this kind of skill and experience to be stronger as a community in how we fight disinformation. I think we have to push against the notion that that this is a technical issue, or that we have to be a digital expert to understand disinformation, because, as we've spoken about, it's really an organizing and communications problem. I have the chance now, and what I'm really pushing also into is how do we bring and sophisticate our understanding of pre-existing problems that are made worse by the technology. And so when it comes to gender and gender disinformation, the work I'm doing through She Persisted is to try to push back against the notion that social media is merely reflecting existing societal bias and sexism and misogyny, to really trying to help our allies and the public at large and regulators understand that it's a behavior modification machine that is in fact making all of these things worse. So let me kind of go on that issue a little bit further to Vanessa and Jacobo. Why is it that there has been a lack of, well, really research and attention and tools to fight back as it relates to Spanish language disinfo and the way that Latinx communities, Latino voters have been targeted in particular? What do you think's underneath that and driving it, and what can we do to, really improve that?
Well, I kick it off, but I'm sure Jacob was going to have lots of thoughts here. Well, I think that the biggest problem is traditionally Spanish language outreach or Latino outreach is really underfunded, and that's a big problem year in and year out. If I have to read another headline again that says, progressives did not invest enough on the Latino vote, my mind is going to explode, literally, because I'm just thinking of Virginia, which happened a few weeks ago. But I think that's the fundamental problem. One is that there's just not enough funding support for constant engagement with our community, with the second largest community in the nation. Latinos are the second largest community, period. And they are huge in key states like Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and on and on. So that's one big problem. I think the second piece is just the communications infrastructure in terms of capacity among progressives. It's also not well resourced. And part of that problem is also the fact that we don't have enough people that are really understand sort of the cultural nuances, just the fact that the Latino community is not monolith. That's something that we often say. In this sort of just approach of one size fits all, really does not apply to the community. Of course, there are things that unite us in terms of our language and parts of our culture, and obviously some of the issues that we all care about, like immigration. But I'm from Bolivia, and I'm very, very different, and I had a completely different experience in sort of just how my family came here from, let's say, someone from Mexico or from Cuba. And I know that we understand that at the intellectual level, but I think that when either campaigns or advocacy groups are developing programs, sometimes we want to take shortcuts. And I think that's just to the detriment of the community and just our overall agenda. And so I would say those two pieces. And then I think what's been really damaging in the last couple of years. So on top of those things, another factor that has been super damaging is the fact that the platforms are also not monitoring for disinformation in Spanish. And it is well documented that Facebook, which is, again, one of the platforms that's highly, highly used by Latinos, they don't have enough Spanish language monitors. And when things are flagged in English to being taken down, they normally move quickly. They're not doing a great job there either, but at least they're moving quick, we will say fairly quickly. But when it comes to Spanish, they don't even have enough eyes looking out for this information in Spanish. And even when people flag, it's often very late. So that's another piece of it. And one of the troubling trends that we saw, especially in 2020, is that when organizations would flag things to Facebook, yeah, they would act, but the thing is, like, they would always Facebook would put the onus on the organizations, like, you are our eyes, so you let us know when you see this information. But obviously by then this information is already running rampant. And then the last thing I would say is that, again, I think the right has really I'm not going to say perfected, but I guess I don't know what other word to use, but when you take a place like Florida, in Miami, Florida, where the right has already built such a robust communications infrastructure, where they have radio, TV, where they have YouTube personalities, and they just have created this complete, ecosystem that feeds off each other. And now you have social media come into that. So it's sort of like the perfect storm to create a lot of information, disinformation that is delivered in language by culturally competent people, right, that speak to their communities. So it is a fairly sophisticated and massive problem that we have in our hands. But I'll stop there because I'm sure Jacobo will add to this.
No, yeah, I totally agree with everything Vanessa just said. I think from a research perspective, and kind of adding on to some of the pieces that Vanessa said, that a lot of as Vanessa said previously, there's not as many researchers kind of looking in this space and looking into like what is spreading in Spanish in these spaces, and also, as Vanessa said, that the platforms are also not as active in Spanish, like moderating the content compared to what they're seeing in English. So I think some of these issues also, we've gotten better over the last couple of years at maybe addressing some of these things, but there's still more improvement that needs to be done. I think one other just overall issue is that because there's just so much disinformation spreading in different spaces, it's often very hard to measure how. We know the problem is big and it's a huge problem, but it's very difficult to measure how much of it is actually happening. And so I think from like maybe a funding perspective, it's also very hard when maybe funders and donors want to see like measurable results on certain pieces, and it's sometimes difficult to show those results because of how much the problem is, and trying to figure out ways to maybe counteract some of these narratives we are seeing, or pushing back against some of this disinformation narratives, and trying to determine different ways to fight back against those pieces. I think a couple other pieces that I think as the Latino community as a whole, like and organizations that are serving the Latino community, a lot of those pieces is we're getting better at as well, but trying to coordinate and have better coordination between everyone to make sure that we're on message, like Vanessa said, and we're all calling for very similar actions, and to make sure that as a community we're trying to not only help our community, but also make sure that this disinformation is that our community is aware about it, so that we can start addressing it and fighting back against some of these pieces.
Mm-hmm. And Jacobo, you come from an opposition research background, and then you were kind of thrust into, well, how do we actually take this for the election work in 2020 and really further figure out what to track and what to monitor and how to make it, useful for the target audiences. As we all know, if we're repeating the disinformation and amplifying it, it only makes things worse. So what kind of, I guess, different expertise did you have to bring to, this equation when it came to not just understanding what the disinformation themes and trends are, but how to package them and how to responsibly advise on what we should do about them?
Yeah, so I think, like Vanessa said earlier, there's like, as the Latino community is not a monolith, so there's so many different angles where, like, for example, in Florida, a lot of the disinformation was targeting the Cuban population, the Venezuelan population, where maybe in, Arizona or Texas, it's targeting the Mexican population. And the narratives are often very similar to the narratives that we're seeing by maybe the broader far right, but there's always a certain angle to it to kind of reach our community. So, for example, in Florida, often like the anti-socialism narratives that we see there are pretty common, and they're kind of feeding into fears that the Latino community there might have due to their background and their history with socialism in the countries that they're coming from. But I think another kind of more difficult piece that is as kind of a process to learn that's maybe different than other research in the disinformation space, and specifically in English, is that in English, a lot of times when you're looking for these narratives, you can use keywords, and like it's very common to use keywords to find a lot of specific narratives. While in Spanish, it's very difficult to, if you're looking for disinformation around Black Lives Matter, which was pretty common last year, you can't just like translate it and expect to be able to see like this is what's happening in the space, because there's so many different ways that people might be describing that. And so a lot of it is like really spending time and resources to be able to build the infrastructure to understand who these key bad actors are in these spaces. And again, they're different in Florida than they are in Texas or in other areas. Some of them are national and some of them are more regional, but being able to spend time and resources to determine those so that you can actually have a strong understanding of what is happening, or how the Latino community is being targeted in different spaces, I think is one important piece that might be a little bit different than maybe some of the way other research is kind of done in not in English or other languages.
Christina, I'm sorry. I just wanted to underscore a point that actually you made, Vanessa, and Jacobo, you're actually, emphasizing here. But the fact that, Facebook or other companies don't have moderators in other languages is a choice that they've made. This is not this is definitely not something that is, by happenstance. They've made these calls not to invest in these resources. And as a result, they are, this is what's happening on the platform. They're letting this happen. And we know this is the case. We know that most of this can't be picked up all the time by AI. You need people who are culturally competent, who understand the language, and who are looking for specific things. And the case in point, for that a lot of people don't remember, is in places like, for example, Germany, where Holocaust denial is actually illegal. Guess what? Facebook can take care of it, and it doesn't happen on the platform. So I think it's really important for people who are listening to remember that these are choices that they are making to not invest in these kinds of resources to solve these problems.
So let's stay with that for a second. But Vanessa, did you have something you wanted to add on the previous point?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the thing that makes it complicated is also for Latinos, it's also the disinformation that's coming from Latin America. And I know that's not just exclusive to Latinos, because other communities also, the API community also sort of has that problem. But that's another nuance when it comes to the research and monitoring, that we are hit from every side, not just the sort of the domestic disinformation, but also what's coming from abroad. And then the other piece that I would say, that one of the most troubling trends of disinformation for me, and something that I worry, this is the thing that keeps me up at night, is sort of the racial tensions that are spread through disinformation. Last year with Lori, we did some work around the sort of racial divisions or just tensions, among communities that were being propagated in both mainstream Spanish language media as well as social media between the Jewish community and the Latino community. There's, as Jacobo mentioned, a ton of disinformation around Black Lives Matter, and just creating more wedges between the Latino community and the African American community, which is why it's so important, right, to have culturally competent monitors that are tracking this, that are flagging this, that are taking this down. And which is why I think that the platforms have such huge responsibility to really invest, because they're really creating a lot of damage to our communities.
Yes. Lori, let's talk for a second. There's a set of solutions that are necessary, right, to get us out from underneath this problem, and no single one feels satisfying, or in fact will resolve all the things that have to be resolved. And so how, when you are working with different advocates who are pushing for important regulation that in essence is needed to get at the source of a lot of the problems, one of the challenges is that that's slow moving. The solutions, for government don't fit on a one-page press release, and now you have, a distortion of what's actually happening in this field, like the so-called conservative bias, that then prevents, legislative action and meaningful changes. So, as you've worked with different organizations who are pushing the policy side, and what has been your lessons as in what sort of skills are needed, not just in understanding digital policy reform, but in the campaigning and communication that you have so much expertise in trying to change the conversation in our public discourse?
Ooh, that's a great question. Big and broad. Well, number one, I would say for anybody who wants to work in the disinformation space, tenacity. This is a dark issue. You sometimes feel like you're just getting hit with the worst of what's happening out in the world on a regular basis, because you're trying to grapple with it and trying to fight back, and you have to fight back in a way that doesn't repeat the bad information. But yet it really weighs on you. So I think anybody who wants to go into the space should be prepared to, with that kind of inner core to know that you're fighting the good fight, but really facing a lot of dangerous things. But beyond that, I mean, I really think there are so many people who are needed in so many different ways. I get the privilege of working with a lot of groups who are doing really smart strategic organizing on the platforms, that are thinking about, really smart comms campaigns that really, target the platforms in the right way to try and move them. They're playing very good inside outside games. So they're both promoting policies to fix this, but also really um, messaging up the harms of what these platforms are doing. And so I would say, definitely folks on the comms and digital pieces who have the ability to tell a story and tell us in a way that people can really understand this. I mean, it is quite amazing to think that, like, there are people who, they go down a couple of roads on this disinformation, and they're taken into a universe that is an alternate universe from which most of us sit on a day-to-day basis, and it feels and is real to them. The information may be wrong, but it feels real to them. And so, to be able to tell an important story that emotionally reaches people and lands the blame clearly in a way that doesn't alienate people on the platforms, to get them to understand that, I think is a really big skill. Um, I think getting people, I think organizers who can help people, um, help lots of groups understand why this issue is something they need to care about, is really important. Just sort of going back to the Jewish community, I don't want to harp there, but we got a lot of groups to actually do something on an issue that they cared about the substance, but they didn't quite connect it to how to make that work from a platform perspective, right? Like why they needed to have this conversation with Facebook, or why they needed to attack YouTube for the bad videos that are on there, right? And also a little bit of trying to bolster people up, right? We spent a lot of time working with groups and giving them the core information to fight back with the platforms. The platforms hire a lot of good people, but then they have tons of resources and tons of lobbying. And so they'll talk you to death. They'll literally just throw person after person at you, and you have to be able to cut through that. So people with the ability to like take information and use it effectively to talk to the platforms, I think, are also really important. So those are some of the things that immediately come to my mind when thinking about, like, how do you want to get into this? Thinking about those different avenues.
Yes, and I love the idea too that everyone has a role to play here. This is not someone else's problem to resolve, or there's no like one organization that actually is the key linchpin in this. What other kinds of, I think, skills, Vanessa and Hakaba, would you say are needed for that the long haul in trying to really day in and day out battle what feels on many days very defeatist and seeing really the bottom of society in many ways and being exposed to that? So how do you keep motivated? What do you have to do to manage your own expectations about success, and how to redefine success? What advice do you have there, Vanessa?
That's a big question. I think in terms of skill set, I'm so grateful that I've kept my Spanish through these years, because now it's like, okay, this is why. So I think, again, I think being bilingual is a huge asset in this space. And again, sort of just being really connected to your community, it's just so important, right? Like I'm sure by now we've all heard about all the WhatsApp groups that are being formed, targeting the Latino community or led by Latinos. And, those spaces are hard to infiltrate unless you are sort of part of those communities. So I think, again, just having that connection to your community, to your roots, is really important. But I think that's at the level of, like, how do we keep an ear out, right, on what's happening, and sort of the information that people are getting. That's, I think, one big piece of it. I do think that we need more people that have the skill set and sort of the support to hold platforms accountable. That's, I think, a big conversation that we need to have, not just in the Latino community, but other communities as well. But also mainstream media, right? Because one of the things that a couple of colleagues of mine have often say, and I completely agree with it, is that disinformation in Spanish has always existed. We all know about sort of the radio station that has a crazy DJ that just says whatever they want, and there's no accountability because it's in Spanish, right? So there also needs to be a conversation with regular media on other languages about, the kinds of information they're promoting in the community. So I would say that that's also an important skill set. And I think that what gives me hope, again, is the one that I believe that there are more of us out there. I believe that we have better ideas, more values. Well, there are values that are more consistent of what we think this country aspires to be. And I think that's worth communicating and really engaging in conversation with people. So, I like to. I have hope on this, but like Lori said, this is a very tough environment because you are reading sort of and seeing, and I don't know how Jacobo does it because he's like living this 24/7, right? Like monitoring this crazy stuff, and it can be very debilitating. But I think at least for me, what motivates me is the fact that, I really believe in the fact that we have to fight for the values that I think we all aspire to in this country. And I think that the ideas and sort of the policies that we are fighting for are consistent with that.
Yeah. I think we have to be hopeful because that's a choice, not an emotion too. Hakabo, how do you stay sane? And what recommendations or warnings do you have for people who are especially on the monitoring side of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just overall. I mean, one, I agree with what everyone else has said, but I think part of it is also just patience. I think like just overall on the disinformation problem, like this isn't going to be solved overnight, or it's not even going to be solved over election cycles where like maybe people who are working in elections, you know, you're trying to win a race, and then if you win, it's kind of done until the next race. And this isn't going to be one of those things where it's going to be solved after 2022 or 2024, or maybe even really ever. The disinformation problem as a whole, we can maybe scale it down to make it not as big of a problem, but it's always going to be there. So having the patience to just to keep fighting for what we believe in and our values and things like that. I think from a research perspective, I think there's a lot going on, a lot of disinformation that's spreading that I see every day, and it definitely sometimes is draining to see a lot how much negative and false information is out there. But I think part of what at least keeps me sane is similar to what others have said. It's just like this is what we're up against, and we're fighting against, and we're trying to make the world a better place. I think overall, in terms of like different jobs in the space and just kind of people's experiences, I think that one thing that we've all kind of talked about is that really anybody who has even any type of campaign experience has some sort of experience that's connected to disinformation, whether it's like an organizer, someone in the digital space, someone in the comm space, someone in the research space, policy. Like there's so much different roles in disinformation or combating disinformation that are needed. And all of those skills that people have, regardless of the level that they're in, is all needed in this space. And research, you know, a lot of it is, you know, attention to detail and being able to catch the right narratives that we're, you know, trying to focus on and seeing which ones are the most problematic. But also, you know, social media is a thing that a lot of maybe younger people are very aware of how to use, and that's like something that we need, like people who are experts on social media, how to use it and how to navigate the different platforms. With all these new platforms coming in every year, there seems to be like a new platform that's, you know, emerging, and so things like that are very important, especially in research, but also just understanding the landscape of these platforms and where it's spreading. So I really do think that might not have been helpful, because I basically said that any skills that you have is useful for here, but I think it's important for people to know that it really is like we need organizers fighting against disinformation. We need comms people. We need policy people. We need research people. We really need all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And can I just add one? I think one positive thing of all of this, at least for me, is that this has forced us to innovate in different ways and get outside sort of our, like, I think our Twitter world, and just, you know, worry about the New York Times, you know, like the mainstream media. I think this has really pushed us to first figure out where are really people getting their information, which is, I think, something that we should have had that conversation years ago. But I think that has forced communicators, digital folks, to figure out where are actually people gaining their information. And two, again, I think that has really pushed us to innovate. Last year, there were really interesting programmatic efforts on this information, like United We Dream, Florida Majority, and other groups, both at the national and at the state level. And and to be honest, I'm kind of excited to see what kinds of new things they come up with, so that they are more effective at communicating their work. But as Jacobo said, that's going to take sort of a village approach, right? Because we do need people's minds and just, you know, ideas and just different ways of us to communicate and to think about this problem.
Yeah, I want to share a resource that really resonated with me, speaking to the issue of the hard work of trying to work towards social justice and a better, healthier democracy is exhausting. And I think we all probably feel that and hear that in the conversations we're having with our colleagues, and is of course made worse by not being able to have the human touch of seeing people's faces and being in these Zoom boxes, you know, all day. And also not necessarily seeing the results ultimately of our work. But there is a new book out there that is part time management and part philosophy, called 4,000 Weeks, which is on average the amount of time we have on the earth. And there's an NPR story I will put in the chat with the message: you can't control time, but you can change your relationship with the clock. And in that interview, the author talks about, why do we do the work that we do? around social justice is not because we will necessarily see exactly the results we want in our lifetime, but because we are part of a very long chain of activities and events and people that are working towards the similar common good that we all share. So I think that for me at least gives a little bit of boost and motivation around what we're doing here and finding people and movements who are still carrying forward. One of the lessons we have, I think, learned collectively around disinfo is that it's not just about debunking and the science of debunking, it's about filling in the gap that is left in people's minds with our own message and getting that out through our own channels. That's challenging, right? To do it in a way that competes with the asymmetrical advantages that the right wing swamp has, because they control much more of the digital properties, and because algorithmically their content we know is gaining traction because of engagement metrics that are meant to do that and monetize that. So it does feel a little defeatist. But what have we sort of collectively seen? I'll put this out to everyone on where the chance to kind of put that counter message can find an audience, and that we don't have to boil the ocean, but that there's a way to do this in something that is targeted and that is taking more control back of what information we put out there in response to the disinformation. Are there any things that have stood out for you, and what your advice would be to organizations that have those trusted relationships with the targets of disinformation where they can disrupt that more effectively? I'm going to actually nudge Vanessa on this because of the cool work last year she did, really with a small amount of money, to put content creators with cultural, uh, significance in their own ability to approach these issues together, and how that then was utilized. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And maybe Lori and Jacobo have other things they want to share too.
Yeah, and Jacobo was very much involved in this, so he can also weigh in here. Yeah, but it was really interesting last year because we did, we were thinking what was needed, right, last year, and everybody was very much focused on the election, and obviously, every organization has its own voice and its own messaging. So we really kind of figure out, okay, let's see what the messaging arc is, and we sort of established the project around, I want to say, late summer. So we spent some time thinking about what the messaging arc would be for us. So, pre-election, election, and we knew we were going to go past the election just to make sure that all the votes were counted. And we really spent some time thinking about what was the messaging that we wanted to deliver. How do we want people to feel about the messaging that we were communicating? And of course, this was very much targeted to the Latinx community. So we hired some creatives, some really creative people that where we brainstorm how to make content that was, first of all, culturally appropriate, of course, that was Spanish, English, Spanglish, that really spoke to sort of the community. But also we wanted it to make it fun, right? Like, so that people were not going to see another political thing that got them down because, our country is going to the, who knows. So we thought about very much, the kinds of feelings that we wanted to elicit in people. So it was about hope, about unity, about laughing at ourselves a little bit about this moment because we're also stressed about the results of the election. But also, again, communicating positivity and also just sort of what progressives stand for, that we stand for supporting each other, that we stand for values that unite us. So we really did a lot of brainstorming about, again, the overall messages that we wanted to communicate, and we try to insert them at certain moments, right? And that's when I spoke about the messaging arc, which I think is a really useful exercise just to think ahead, because I think as communicators or organizers or activists, one of our biggest challenges is to actually plan ahead, because there's a crisis every day in front of us, every minute, right? And we're always trying to respond to that. but I think just the work of just planning ahead, thinking through what you want to communicate over a period of time is really important. So anyway, so we created really great content, and I wish I could share that with you, but we use like some telenovelas, graphics. We use Walter Mercado, and I know I'm throwing things that only Latinos are gonna understand, I think. But it was really fun, and then we used that content, and it was unbranded, so we shared it with folks, so any organization or any individual for that matter could just take it and post it on their Facebook page, put it on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. And we felt it was just a really sort of helpful resource and tool for organizations to use. And then with Christina, we did a couple of videos. I feel like one of our most successful videos was a video about the life of a ballot, and this was right around, of course, election, and that really explained the process to people, of course, at a 3,000-foot level, because we're not going to go in detail, but it talked about like the safeguard measures that our system has, the people that that are part of the process, to demystify this notion that, oh my God, people are somebody is going to mess up with our electoral system. So that video, we did it also in Spanish, and I think it was very successful. In fact, I was just talking to folks from Make the Road Nevada this week, and they remember that video clearly because they felt it was very useful. So anyway, the point being, it's just making sure that you are being creative and bringing people from different backgrounds to come up with creative ideas on content that would actually speak to the communities that you're talking to. So that's something that I think was a lot of fun, and also Jacobo had a little hand in that too. So
yeah, I definitely agree with all of that, and I think one thing that maybe we can learn from the right and what they did in Florida, not necessarily the disinformation they spread, but the ecosystem that they built there, that it's possible to build these small ecosystems to spread good information and accurate information. And I think one thing that we see in Spanish is just like these information voids where there's not places for people to get good and accurate information. So they go to social media and then fall into these traps. And so I think part of it is also continuing to do the things that Vanessa said, but also built like using trusted messengers, local messengers too, though, specifically like local, and building local. Even if you're creating videos for just your community that are smaller, that's still important. Building that out, and making sure that people have places to get good information.
And I also think, and a lot of this points to work that Christina, you had up last year, but was the work around sort of free and fair elections, and particularly not only the life of the ballot, but the extension of the fact that like voting wasn't going to be one day, right? That we were going to have sort of a voting period, and sort of the kind of the Democratic and left community progressive community trying to make sure that people understood what they should expect around the elections. And I think, despite the big lie, I think we did a really good job making sure, people did not, sort of freak out when there weren't results at the end of the night, in 2020. So I think that was a really, really important piece of work that like a lot of people on our side helped have a hand in as well.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think we got the benefit of celebrating that amazing victory of like unprecedented coordination with incredible impact of progressive voices, because we went right into the horrifying events of the insurrection, and then had a new set of problems in which to focus on. So I think we do need to think about that for 2022 and what continued unprecedented, coordination really looks like. I want to bring up an issue, and while I do, I'll say to anyone listening, if you have questions, you can put in the chat. We can go to that next. But the career potential for disinformation is also dependent on what the donors of this field prioritize, be that the party structures and how they are fighting on the hard side or on the soft side of what advocacy and philanthropy are able to do. And often we have a set of donors who are looking for a quick fix, or on the philanthropic side, putting way too much emphasis on things like media and digital literacy, which will not really ever move at the speed in which the disinformation is. We've had a really important conversation with the most recent whistleblower, Frances Haugen, really trying to help change the zeitgeist opinion, I think, too, about the harms of platforms. And some of what is talked about in Light of Solutions is more on the tweaking end of the technology, which we can debate about whether that actually gets at root causes. But all sorts of things are needed. Does our donor community properly invest in making careers in which those of us can try to work towards defeating disinformation more viable? Where do we see the philanthropic end of things that enhances how we have, both the skills, resilience, and interest of different pockets of our very talented progressive community deciding that this is an area that they want to take on? Lori, you've worked in and with lots of different types of philanthropic organizations and others, and including with the DNC. So how do you see the resource side of this, and what do we need to do to make the case about the people part of disinfo fighting and what's needed?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I will say I do think the donor community has come a long way in this, right? That there is way more investment in pieces that are really needed, the building blocks of fighting back on this. So, for folks who are listening, I mean, even, the DNC does run a project on this and, helps with candidates. But also, the project that we've been involved with definitely is helping to train organizations. There's so many more organizations in the space. I think if I were to sort of think about, how do we, um, get some of these donors to invest in sort of the people end of the equation. I really do think it would be great to sort of um, get folk. I mean, how do I say this? The digital literacy piece of this is, as you say, is not where the problem is, right? That we need to invest in these kind of networks of how do you push out in positive ways and how do we use those ecosystems that have been created. And I think that we probably need to do a better job, or more about showing some of those donors kind of the networks that exist on the right, and trying to figure out, how we can replicate some proactive elements, the piece that we were just talking about, with the creative content, right? And trying to put out more of that proactive sort of messaging, I think would do us a world of good, if we could sort of be taking advantage of this and trying to make more of what, of sort of the platform elements. So it's a
Yeah.
hard one though.
It is. And you're right. There's absolutely been improvement, and a higher level of investment that one hopes continues. Um,
Yeah, and we should mention too, I mean, the other piece that I find, um, really problematic in this is the lack of local journalism these days, right? That sort of, withering of kind of the local information that people trust and is, you know, close to the ground so that it's much more accurate. I mean, I think that's just been devastating to sort of the whole truth factor in this. And so, there are some efforts there, but not as much.
I think what also will help us all in having the proper level of investment and being able to innovate in this space is also demonstrating cooperation and transparency. There are some aspects of disinfo fighting that are still in the beta testing, I would say. The way that we really try to apply de-radicalization from other countries is complex, and in fact, has some pitfalls, especially in the role of the security sector. So there's differences, and I spend a lot of time looking at how we apply some of those experiences from other places, and how we don't, but what the collective lessons are. But I think we would go a long ways in trying to make this a problem that seems resolvable if we also are sharing information across organizations and the real kind of lessons about how to do this. Vanessa, have you seen ways in which to model that? And what's been your experience on groups maybe wanting to be the champion of one particular takedown, or feeling maybe competitive about how to prove their smarts in this field?
I think that's a common problem, right? Everybody wants to be able to say we have the key solution, right? We have the silver bullet, but there is no silver bullet. And I think it's actually a detriment if only one group is sort of like doing all the things. I think if there is one lesson from the right, it's just sort of how they maximize through the network and how they use different organizations and different structures, and how they coordinate. So that's one thing that I already said at the top of my remarks, that a key thing here is coordination, that everybody has a role and that there's no one organization that's going to fix this. Every organization needs to have a disinformation program in place. um, we need creativity, we need innovation, and we need to learn from each other. One of the reasons why I mentioned the work that United We Dream and also Florida Majority has done is because they are I'm naming them because I think it's important to look to other organizations and say, what did you do last year? What worked? What didn't? So that we can learn from each other. And because that's also we have to make sure our own information spreads, right? So we have to use all our channels, all our people, all our orgs, and ensure that we are also filling the gap of information with sort of our accurate information. So I think it's normal to be competitive. I think it's normal for people to want to sort of do their own thing, but I think especially in this instance, and I would also argue that one of the reasons why we were successful last year in 2020, just as a movement, is because we all were working together, amplifying each other's messaging, being consistent with our own messaging around the elections. And I believe that's actually one example of how this can really work when we all are working towards a same goal with different tactics, with sort of everybody has sort of their own way of doing things, but we're all rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, and I just to make make a point on the
Mhm.
gender dynamics of this too. I think when the more technical part of the field started, to dominate, and really still in some ways does, it's a very kind of bro culture. That this like smartest and best investigator will then put something forward that results in the New York Times, and then suddenly a referee is going to jump out of the sky and solve this problem. So I think that's not happening. And the more we create a culture of sharing that maybe goes against the instincts of some of those on the investigative side, we need those investigators, but we also have to match it with what do we do with this information.
Can I just add something to Christina? Because I think this is also an important lesson, is that we don't need like, I feel like it's a space where all the consultants are going to come, and I'm a consultant, so it's not that I am like, speaking against consultants, but we have capacity in our movement. And this is a communications problem. And I think that one development that I've seen is that everybody now wants to monitor, right? Social media, which is okay, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of organizations that are doing monitoring already, and sometimes it makes sense to be able to share that and just utilize that versus you trying to sort of create something new when you could be deploying those resources to the actual communicating, right? So I would just put that caution out there, because I do feel like it's a space that can be very much exploited by the consultant sort of world, and just trying to replicate other things that are already happening. So
Yeah, luckily, I think consultants haven't figured out how we can make a lot of money off of this. So, and if they're trying to sell you some dashboard that's going to resolve all your monitoring and disinfo fighting, don't believe it. So back to that innovation, transparency, and I think humility that is necessary in this field. Lori, any comments on any of those threads?
No, I completely agree, that there are no silver bullets here, so certainly don't believe that. There yeah, and I completely agree, that sometimes we do have to resist the urge and do more coordination. The resources are way better spent putting out positive messages and, pushing back. So I would totally agree with Vanessa on that.
Yeah.
There's also, I'm sorry, I was just noticing a couple of comments in the chat. There was one on the infiltrating our message on their platforms. I will say I don't think any of us would say that that's gonna change the equation, but there are some programs that we have seen where you can try and sort of um, push people to different places before they actually go down the rabbit hole. There is, and this is where, sort of that proactive messaging comes in, right? If you can sort of message to the right groups of people in a way that is resonant to them, with their value base and with the, sort of interesting information, you know, that they're interested in hearing, there is a way to pivot them to a better path. So I wouldn't say infiltration, but I think, there's a way to redirect people.
Mhm. And within their value system is the key
Yep.
part of how to do that. But it's complex, and a lot we don't control there. I think when we have to balance against focusing on the things we do control within our own communication environment. I see another question too from Jonathan. Are you aware of any organizations working to combat misinformation, radicalization within military veterans? I will point to Chris Goldsmith, who has done tremendous work, really just on his own as a veteran, and seeing what his fellow veterans were saying and their path to radicalization. So check out what he's doing. He's on Twitter, Chris Goldsmith with a K. Lori may know of some other organizations as she thinks about that. Let me just say, I think this panel really shows that everyone is also kind of leaning into their own interest areas, and that's then where the innovation comes. For me, it's been women. For Vanessa, it's been trying to close the gap on Spanish language and disinformation there, and Jacobo the same, and how to really innovate the way that we do research and monitor and get this to the right folks. And for Lori, the work with the against anti-Semitism was incredible. And trying to find ways to get that community more engaged on the technology and smarter platform pushback side, which was really important. Any other veteran organizations that anyone can point to?
Vote Vets has done a little bit of work in this space, but not in the same, not as sort of one of their core programs, but they are very much looking at these same patterns of radicalization and trying to work on that as well. So this is newer to them, but they're definitely working on it.
Okay. And I'll go to a question here. Speakers is, in the digital age where information spreads fast, what would you think is the most important focus to help branch out and do the damage control, combat disinformation to the masses? So we've highlighted a few ideas around that, but back to the point, no silver bullet here. Using your own channels where you have ability to impact through messengers that have trust. Other things our panel would point to.
I would say, I think that the most important thing that we can do is prepare ourselves for it. Going back to the point I made earlier, I think we're just so like in the weeds day in and day out. But I think taking the time to think about, okay, and I want to emphasize this so much, we already know what the right is saying, right? And Jacobo can hopefully support me on this. We know their themes, right? They're talking about socialism, they're talking about immigration, they're talking about critical race theory. So they're not they're not changing their messaging year to year. It's sustained. So we know what they're saying, therefore we have to prepare for that. And of course, there's nuance in how the, like, for example, in Virginia, they use the whole critical race theory to their great advantage here in Virginia, making it very localized. And I think we know their sauce, their secret sauce, right? So I think taking the time to really think through about how those messagings play out at the local level, affecting your organization, is really key. Understanding, right, what are the different levels of, not responses, but how you can best interrupt this information is also really important. As part of the project that we're all engaged in, we do a lot of trainings about smart social listening, but also how to create a plan, right, based on different scenarios of disinformation. So I think spending the time to do that now before things are crazy in 2022 is hugely important, and certainly before 2024. But I would say that that's a really important thing. And the other piece of it, sometimes are so we are just so focused on the attacks on the right and the disinformation from the right, and we're trying to debunk all those things, that we forget that the most important tool that we have is actually communicate our message, communicate an alternative vision. And so it needs to be both, right? It needs to be figuring out what they're saying, but also being very proactive in what we are communicating, because that's what people need. They need to see what we stand for, what we think about issues. That's what that we also need to be doing.
Mm-hmm. It looks like we are at time, but let's do just a quick wrap up back to the focus of the panel, which is career advice for this field. So any sort of quick remaining last pieces of advice and wisdom you can share. Let's start with Jacobo.
I would just say that, I mean, we really need more people in this space. And as we've talked about, there's a lot of solutions that we're working on now that might be effective, but there's also other solutions that people haven't explored, or ideas that haven't happened yet. So people who have, maybe entrepreneurial spirit or creative spirit or creative ideas, we need more people and new ideas to try to combat these efforts. And so that's my, I guess, advice or wisdom, that we need more people, and especially people who are creative and have new ideas to fight this problem.
Exactly. Lori.
I would say, in the last 2 to 3 years, there has been an explosion of groups in this space. There are literally hundreds of organizations that work on disinfo in some aspect. So do the research. Don't feel like you have to start from scratch and start something new. Look at the different organizations, whether they're policy or think tank or advocacy, or sort of tech accountability groups. They exist. You just need to find your niche in them, and there's plenty to choose from.
Vanessa?
I think that I would say the research piece, the investigative piece, I would love to see more investigators, especially people of color. We need them. So not just on the monitoring side, but also in sort of the long-term research, in terms of the sort of, deep investigative work that's really needed, because we need those experts to be able to point them to work, especially as we turn to hopefully policy solutions. But there's definitely a lot of need in this space for more voices, more people that bring their sort of innovation and their new ideas to this issue.
Mm-hmm. I would say use your own channels of communication and influence. For me, that's taken the form of making a commitment to write more, and have more of a public voice. Even though it tortures me every time I see an article coming back from Brookings that's, working with an editor there, like, it's hard to get those pieces together. And, we're very quick moving on the campaign side. And so then doing long form writing. But if we had more of that, people who actually understand campaigns and elections, talking about fighting disinformation, not just academics and think tanks who don't actually understand communication environments, I think we would be stronger. So find a way to have your own voice in this, participate in podcasts, use your own social media channels, write a longer form article. Like, there are solutions out there. And the more we focus on the solutions to this, not just all of the problems with disinformation, the further we will motivate our own community that we can actually work step by step in combating this. And I truly believe that we can. So thank you to this wonderful panel, and thank you to Amy and Global Gain and Global, all of the global projects and global initiatives that Amy is putting forward for us. Wonderful to be here with everybody today, and have a wonderful weekend, and let's all carry on.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you. Bye-bye.